Hi, everyone. If you're joining us for the first time or if this is your fourth session of the day, welcome to the Brass Fall 2025 Online Symposium. I'm Nora McKenzie. I'm the chair of the Business Reference and Academic Libraries Committee for Brass and also the co-chair of the Symposia Subcommittee alongside Kelly LaVoice. We also have a fabulous subcommittee who helps support all the work and make sure everything runs smoothly. And those members include Christy Cunningham, Kate Cummings, Brian Garrison Wynn, and Doris Dewey. All of our sessions today have been recorded or this one is being recorded currently, and those recordings will be sent out after the symposium along with the slides from the presenters. If you haven't already, go ahead and mute your audio and your video as we get started. Thank you again so much for spending time with Brass today. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kate Cummings, who is our next moderator.
Hello, everyone. So I am introducing our next speaker, Kierra Holst, who is giving a talk, BYO-AI, meeting students at their research process. All right, Kierra, take it away.
Thank you so much. Sure. All right. Thank you guys for joining me. Like I said, my name is Kierra Holst. I am the current business librarian at the University of North Texas. I am an early career librarian with a previous background in logistics, sports administration, and athletics before I switched over. So I'm currently I think I'm going into my third year right now of librarianship and third one as a business librarian. This presentation is an overview of a library instruction session that was given in the spring of 2025 when I was a business librarian at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. This session was a collaborative effort between myself, our health sciences librarian, and two AI forward faculty in the health administration department. So let's get going. So our agenda for today, we're going to be going over the background and the purpose of this instruction session, how the session was designed, our desired outcomes for both the instructors, so myself and the other librarian, the faculty, and then the desired outcomes for our students. We then are going to go over how the instruction session went and what we went through and the different selections in that, and then finally the reflections thereafter. But before we really dive into anything, the purpose of this entire presentation and for the instruction session was to ask one big question, which is what problems are students using AI to solve and how we as librarians can help fix those. So if we want to go ahead and use the QR code either on the screen or through the link that will be added into the chat, we can go ahead and see where we're finding any of this information and answer that very important question right there. Sorry. Writing is the big one. Oh yeah. Lots of research in class, articles, a lot of reading, a lot of student research. Outlines is a big one I've seen a lot. So writing is becoming one. Research and writing, oh my goodness, you guys are typing so fast. A lot of prep, a lot of citations, different kinds of assignments, a lot of articles. Hopefully they're not using it too much. Streamlining a lot of work. Almost everything. I see everything as a big word in here a lot. As a time saver, we do see a little bit of laziness going on there. So it looks like a lot of the big question or like big problems they're trying to find is like any of their research problems, a lot of writing, trying to find answers. We get a lot of hopefully they aren't using it too much, although unfortunately that time has now passed. A lot of streamlining of different areas and different topics, and a lot of discussion and everything overall. So thank you guys for that. So we thought the same thing. So back when I got this initial request, our faculty came to me and asked to have this instruction session. This was a continuation of a previous AI instruction session with the same small cohort of graduate students, where previously we had gone over Copilot and its uses there. So their big question here was, what other AI are they using? Why are they using these AIs? And then what problem is the AI solving for the students that our resources aren't solving for them? And then how are we going to be able to create an encouraging environment where the students can come forward and talk about their uncertainty in this area? A lot of the problems that this faculty was facing was that their students didn't want to begin the conversation about AI initially, and therefore they were coming up with a couple of different problems. First of all, the students had a lot of uncertainty when they were going forward. They weren't sure if they were allowed to use AI. We had different policies in different areas. For example, when I worked back at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, our AI policy was very much based on whatever the faculty thought was best for their specific class. Our overarching policy left a lot of leeway, and therefore a lot of students were confused about what was and was not approved for the different areas. Other students expressed that they were a little bit ashamed to admit that they were using AI in different areas and therefore did not want to bring this question forward. This is something I had encountered a few times in different research consultations and therefore thought it was a bit of an issue to bring up. And therefore, when our faculty came forward saying that they themselves were unsure of what AI our students were using, this is where they wanted to be able to begin the conversation so that the students felt comfortable bringing those questions forward to us. For our session, we ended up having a lot of area to work with. So like I said, this was a continuation of a previous course. For the initial resource, this was for a business administration 757 managed healthcare and integrated healthcare class. So there was a lot of overlap between business and healthcare, which is why our health sciences librarian was involved in this session as well. We ended up breaking this down into 3 different sections. First, we wanted to do a student-led AI discussion where they brought forward an AI that they're using in different aspects of their research. So this was meant to be a big use of their searching as a strategic exploration. And we wanted to make sure they were going to be bringing forth different areas, and therefore we could get that communication and discussion going. The second part of our session was doing a practice research question using an AI. It didn't have to be the one they brought forward, or it could be one of the ones that they had already worked on. The practice question was just going to be delving in to see what types of resources were available to them as well. The third part of our session was going to be using database research. This is where we always reiterate what databases we have available to us. And at this point, it was going to be a bit of a redundant effort where we had already discussed these databases. The students work best with hands-on work, and so we brought those back so that they could finalize and compare and contrast. Like I said, these are grad students with a lot of AI experience. They had previously had an AI library session in the fall of 2024 with both myself and the other librarians. So they are both familiar with us, how we work, and what AI experience we had as well. However, the big sticking point and the big change from the previous session to this one is we wanted to ask the students to bring in any sorts of AI they use at any stage of their research. If they were touching AI in any way, shape, or form, we would like to know, and we wanted to see how they used it and how we could adapt to it and bring that conversation going. Now, the absolute best part of this session for me was that this was a 2-hour fully dedicated online session. That means I had full reign to do whatever we wanted to do for those entire 2 hours. This ended up actually being with one librarian, myself. Our other health sciences librarian had to back out for a separate reason, and with 2 dedicated faculty members. Our previous session was that 1.5-hour session with 2 librarians where we went over generative AI and kickstarting research. So again, the students had some familiarity in different areas. Once our desired outcomes for this session were broken into 2 different areas. First, our instructors. We wanted to, at the end of the session, we wanted to know what types of AI the students were going to be using. We wanted to know where in their research process this was going on. We were unsure if it was a very front-loaded section, if they were using it to discover articles and other data, or if they're using it more at the end. And finally, that big question was, what problem was AI solving for them? Were they looking to it for writing experience? Were they looking to it for research? Or were they unsure where to start and just asking it general questions? For the students, we wanted them to feel comfortable being able to come forward. This was a small group discussion, and that with librarians they had already met, with faculty they had been familiar with. And since this was a small cohort that had worked together previously, they were able to be more talkative and come forward in different areas. Next, we wanted to make sure that students had increased their AI literacy in their research. This meant being able to analyze the results, understand how different areas of their research were being used in different AIs, and then finally lock down a lot of those good use cases for different AIs and what their scenarios might look like there. Now for the biggest part of this whole instruction session was the AI show and tell. We had 9 students in this class. It was a little bit smaller than usual, but I think it was better for a couple of different reasons. The students ended up bringing 4 total AIs. That was Semantic Scholar, Copilot, ChatGPT, and Research Rabbit. However, that's not reflective of all the AIs they mentioned. ChatGPT and Copilot were mentioned by every one of their students, and Semantic Scholar and Research Rabbit were only mentioned by 2 different students. So the majority of the students were using generative AI, and less of them were using research-based AIs. So as you can see, we got a little bit of a mix. However, it was more heavily handled in the generative AI area, and we were able to discuss those use cases for each type. What this show and tell ended up being was we had set aside 30 to 40 minutes to discuss these AIs. It ended up taking a full hour, which I was very comfortable with since we were already given that 2-hour time limit. We had students who were very comfortable and they were asking very great questions so that we could lead their discussion. I initially started the discussion by having each student come forward and talk, if they wanted to, about what different types of AIs they were using. All of these AIs had been sent to me before the instruction session started, along with their main research question. This was done beforehand through just different talks with myself and our faculty members so that we can make sure to lock down and have an understanding of what they were using so that I had familiarity and understanding of it and was able to use it in front of the students with a level of confidence. So our discussion started out if they wanted to demonstrate. If not, I was happy to demonstrate different tools. And then we talked about where they were using them. At what stage was it going to be more common? So what ended up happening was a lot of students were using it very heavily at the forefront of their research. They were using AI to generate keywords. A lot of it was coming into outlining or just asking where they should start their research or how they should even start. So what happens is the AIs was catching them before they even came to our librarians in order to ask these same questions. And so the discussion there was trying to figure out how they can feel comfortable coming to us as individuals who work at the university and have access to these tools and why they're going to the AIs in the first place. Again, this was an open dialogue, so any student could come in and discuss why they did not want to do this. This was not a recorded session, and I barely took any notes so that the students could have the good level of privacy. My only note taking during this was highlighting a few key terms that the students repeated multiple times so that they felt comfortable being able to come forward. A second part of the discussion, and one that took more of the time than anticipated, was what level of familiarity they had with these different AIs. A lot of the students had a high level of familiarity with ChatGPT. They all had a level of familiarity with Copilot since we had already gone over that in the previous session. However, a lot of the students had not used Copilot as much as they had thought they would after that initial session. So this was a fall to spring course. So when we initially met them in the fall of 2024, I believe it was in November, and then we saw them again in March of 2025. The students said they weren't using Copilot as much as they thought they would and had reverted back to ChatGPT for most of their research. Well, another problem that we ended up having was that students weren't as familiar with different types of AIs that were being used. For example, I demonstrated Semantic Scholar to some of them, and the other students weren't familiar with it, and so a lot of our time was spent discussing the different types of AIs and what they were built for and different reasons. Finally, we ended up discussing the strengths and limitations of each of these AIs and the difference between them. Then we opened the floor for a lot of questions. The students' questions mostly geared around academic integrity. They wanted to know what types of AIs were going to be school approved. They had a lot of questions about how to cite AI. And then finally, they really wanted to know what specific AIs we could use for research other than the ones that we had brought forth here. The good thing about this is that I had already created an AI LibGuide at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee that outlined a lot of these areas, including different charts to compare and contrast which AIs were going to be useful in general. So the main problem that they had was, again, being unsure in this different area, but with this open dialogue, they were able to push past a lot of that insecurity and be able to discuss this with their faculty members who were both positive and receptive and highly encouraging of using AI in different areas as long as the students cited it. The second part of our instruction session was the AI research activity. This is where we went through a deeper Copilot demonstration. In our previous discussion, we didn't dive into Copilot as much since I knew this was coming forward. Instead, we focused on the other AIs we had in general. And then this section here reiterated what we had discussed previously. For Copilot, it was heavy in the text generation, the article research, and then really discussing and locking down into the prompt engineering. There's a lot of different prompting tools we can use in order to generate better AI searches, and the students were lacking some of that ability there. So a lot of this instruction session ended up being a discussion about how to ask for comparative analyses, how to request information about key stakeholders, and then creating date ranges so that they would have a more tailored results. As this was a health sciences and business question, they were given a specific question in order to search for both of their research activities. The question this time was a topic search for innovation models from the CMS Innovation Center, and they were supposed to use Copilot, or they were able to use any of the other AIs that we had generated or that we had brought forward. They were all sent into breakout rooms for about 10 minutes where myself and the two other faculty hopped in and out in order to understand what their discussions were. And then we came back and showcased all of our results and started another discussion from there. Thankfully, we had a very chatty bunch of students. I was very lucky that, again, these 9 students were comfortable with each other and were highly encouraged and were able to discuss and be willing. This would have been a little bit more difficult in a larger class, but thankfully, since we had a lot of time and a high level of familiarity, we were able to have these high level discussions. So our discussion about the Copilot results really focused on the strengths and limitations of the results there. For example, the students really enjoyed the language model. They thought it was very nice to be able to use natural language and ask for information there and get good results. They also really enjoyed the sleek and more clean-cut look of the AIs. They expressed multiple times that they thought it just looked better if they were using something simple like ChatGPT or Copilot or even Research Rabbit, which had a slightly more simple look. Some of the limitations they found were things that we reiterated before. Most of the Copilot limitations they found were repetitive sources, although they did really enjoy being able to link out to different things. However, a lot of that discussion also turned into paywalls and how using library resources, you might not hit those paywalls as well. The information types we were able to gain from there as well was another heavy topic of conversation. For example, the students were discussed interest in being able to, in finding out that most of the information they were able to get from Copilot was all open source or government resource documents. They a lot of their heavier use for Copilot and for ChatGPT was that they wanted to use government resources and documents for this type of information, and they felt like they couldn't go through library resources for that. I'll put a pin in that. The next area of discussion was the different strategies used here. For example, we went back to a lot of the prompting tips that they had and how to use natural languages in order to pull the best possible results and why they had to try multiple times in order to get different types of information pulled forward and the frustrations that kept coming up when they were pulling the exact same articles each time and the limited information that was coming out from there. Finally, we talked about what the next steps in their research process would be if this was the first step they took in order to look up information. And then finally, the last area of their comparison was a comparison between the previous AI that they had used, Copilot, and the types of information they got in different areas. So remember, they did also have Semantic Scholar and Research Rabbit that they were allowed to use and go look up. information and finding different types of different articles, different highlights from Copilot to ChatGPT, Semantic Scholar, and Research Rabbit, and how those were pulling different types of information, which also reiterated to them that it was useful and helpful to look into multiple resources to find different types of data. So the last part of our instruction session was our database research. This finalized in a database demo. And I will actually preface this by saying the students did have a small 10-minute break in between these. We did not go straight for 2 hours. I could tell even they were losing a lot of their wind. So we did break and come back for the final database demo. These were a little bit of a review for some of the students. They have had PubMed demonstrations before, but now we added ProQuest One Business into this as well, or right now I only have ABI Inform, but ProQuest One Business was what we had at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. So we went through demonstrations of these as well, and we did discuss the database AIs that were turned on at the time. So ProQuest did have its AI turned on, and we were able to go through the different types of information and resources that the AIs for the database were able to provide, and PubMed had no AIs to use. They used the same question as previously. They're looking up some information on Medicare and Medicaid and the innovation models. They went to the same 10-minute breakout rooms and were encouraged to only use these 2 databases in order to find information, or a different database on the library's page if they felt like it. However, we encourage them to not use any AIs in this research so that we could properly compare and contrast. Now, the interesting thing about the discussion of this section was the strengths and limitations as well. Something that the students had thought was a strength for the AIs, which was the more simplistic look of them and the easy natural language, was a different strength for the databases. They did initially find the database pages like PubMed and ProQuest to be a little bit more busy and a little bit more intimidating for them to start looking into. And so they started out a little bit on the back foot. And by the end of it, they found that the filtering systems and being able to use keyword searches instead of longer, more direct prompting tips, that they were able to find more targeted and better results, which was a positive in my book. Some of the limitations they said was that the inflexibility of the searching parameters. They found that having to go and click through a lot of different things put them off of trying to research this way as much. Something that has been an ongoing theme in a lot of current research is how many clicks it takes for a student to get from one page to the next. So this was a problem they brought up. They were encouraged by the types of information they found. We're looking more into scholarly resources, and they were finding better results on our databases than they were previously on the AIs. The adjustment of their previous strategies from using an AI resource to using a database resource was something that they had mentioned they didn't think about when they went into it. So some students will automatically naturally go and type in their entire question. They realized they had those and had to apply different strategies with different filtering, different keywords, and that it was a little bit clunkier for them to try and find information where they really enjoyed the streamlined view of the initial AIs. Here we also brought up what their next steps in their research would be, which would be gathering all their information together, comparing and reading through what they had found. A lot of them were encouraged by the sheer amount of data that they were able to pull from the databases, which was encouraging as well. And then finally, we ended up with a discussion comparing and contrasting their AIs, including their generative AIs, the research AIs, and then finally our databases and what types of data they're able to find and why different areas and aspects of their research would be benefited from focusing on one area or the other. So at the end of the session, we had a bit of reflection. I had a sit down with the 2 faculty and the librarian who was unable to make it. And then we ended up discussing these questions in more depth. So what types of AI were the students using? It was very heavy on the generative AI. They did not use the research-specific AIs as much. In fact, they were unsure about where to find them until we pulled up the LibGuide that had been created where they had a good compare and contrast. But most of their information and their searching was done on generative AI types, heavily on the ChatGPT. However, they were switching a little bit to Copilot by the end of it. So where in their research process were they using the AI? Again, it was very front loaded. They were using it at the initial stage. A lot of their deeper research was not very AI heavy. However, they used it heavily at the end as well in order to create the outlines for their writing and then to review what they had written to make sure it looked nice and clean. And then what problem was AI solving for them? For a lot of them, the problem was starting out and going from there. They were unsure about where to start and how to start, and AIs were solving that problem for them and giving them the locations about where to begin and then setting them up on their research process. So a lot of these issues came along with keyword generation, and an ongoing theme was because this was a medical and administrative research course, that some people who did not have a medical background were unsure of key terms and industry terms. So they were using AIs in order to get themselves comfortable with the background information. One of the students even said that it felt like the new Wikipedia to them. They could go and interact with it and discuss what types of information they didn't know about the background of their topic so they could research with a little bit more comfort. For the students, we did have some reflection questions for them. Most of it was in person. However, we did have 2 survey questions I will get to. The students at the end of it were more comfortable in being able to ask questions. Dialogue was very open. They were able to come in with a lot of big questions for us, for myself, for the other faculty, and I did get email responses afterward from the students to continue on with their research. A lot of them did increase some of their AI literacy. They were able to scrutinize some of the information a little bit more and understand what types of data was being pulled from different areas, especially when it came to the generative AIs and how that data was being reflected back to them. And then finally, they were able to determine more of the use cases for different types of AIs and why they would want to use them in different areas. For example, we discussed Copilot again and about generating more key terms and being able to pull background information. Again, with them talking about it as a new Wikipedia and being able to pull that information from where they were lacking and then use that as a next step in order to go into their database research. For the outcomes, we did have 2 questions for our student feedback. The first question was, what is something you learned today? And then the second question was, what is something you wish you learned, or what other questions do you still have? A lot of the responses were saying they learned more about what generative AI is in general. They learned that they had LibGuides that they had not known about before, so we're always pushing those. And then something they want to continue learning was more about research-specific AIs. So thankfully, we did have those LibGuides for them that had more research-focused AIs that they could use and that they could come back to the librarians anytime, and we'd be able to answer all of their questions without prejudice or bias and make them feel comfortable and returning to the library, be it either in person or online, in order to continue these questions on. So another area that we felt was positive was that the repeated exposure to these databases and AIs were able to get them a little bit more appreciation of the databases. Like I said, initially, they really enjoyed the more streamlined and clear-cut process that the AIs would give them, and they were able to navigate that with more ease. However, once we went through the databases again and had that nice one-to-one comparison, the types of data and the depth of data in the databases, they could really understand and see what types of information they were able to get from there and use the filtering system to the best of their abilities. And therefore, a lot of them have more positive experiences with the databases at the end of it. And then finally, they were able to increase their evaluation of those AI-generated responses. A lot of them said they hadn't considered where this information comes from and the type of responses that they get. A lot of them just use it like it's searching the entire internet. However, when you consider that ChatGPT is more like a black box tool, they understand that pulling external information is not something that a lot of these generative AIs are able to do. Some of the successes that we had with this session. Again, thankfully, it was a second session with graduate students who had already been through this, was we were able to do a lot of high-level active learning with these students. This was the type of sit-down and high-level discussion that the faculty had really wanted and really dreamed of, and they were extremely happy to have their students have such high level hands-on activities with the different types of AI and databases. It was really the best of both worlds and went very, very well. The other major success was the students felt a lot of validation of the tools that they are currently using. Part of the problem
5
initially they said
minutes.
was they weren't sure what tools they were able to bring in and what was going to be beneficial in different areas. So by having them come and bring tools and us talk about what benefits they could have during research made them feel a lot more positive and more confident going into a lot of their other research. Some of the challenges we had with this, should we do a similar class here at UNT, was there were a lot of skill constraints that we had. Some of the students were unfamiliar with different AIs, and then there were active computer skill problems. So if we are looking up different information, some students may not have the technical capabilities to follow along with some of our AI guides, which is again why our initial discussion took that full hour, was because we had a lot of repeated work and a lot of them had never used some of these tools hands-on, so they had some issues there. Thankfully, we were able to work on a lot of them, but that is something to take into consideration if you do this course and this sort of instruction in a lower level course. I know I put time constraints in there as I was very happy to have full 2 hours, but we did have some time constraints. Again, you wish you could just talk all day long and work on these things, but the students need time to play with it themselves and to sit on this. And then if you go for too long, again, it was a full 2 hour session, you start to lose a lot of that attention there. Even if they're actively learning, you can see that their attention is fading by the end of it. And so maybe a shorter session would probably be better in the future. One of our other challenges was our assessment difficulties. With our second librarian unable to participate, I was trying to keep track of notes manually and then try to keep our students' privacy in consideration, and then only had a short survey at the very end. Should I do this course again, I would want to work out different ways to assess the students during and after the course in order to make sure that we're getting them the best information they want and all of the right data that they need. And then finally, this was a big challenge, especially since we had initially done one of these classes in the fall of 2024. This was in the spring of 2025, and now we're in the fall of 2025. There are new tools constantly out there, and being able to keep up with all of them, even in the short time difference between the fall and the spring, new tools are popping up, and every time the students would come in and have another question, I might not know those tools. So this is why I asked beforehand they would bring in tools so that I could learn about them to make sure I was familiar beforehand. If not, we might have had more of an issue with that. And I have had students come to me beforehand and bring in tools I am uncertain of, and then have to go and learn and see how we can apply it in different areas. So this is a ongoing concern and a challenge when you're doing any of these instruction sessions, is the constantly having to update and making sure we're staying consistent. And that is going to be the end of my session. Thank you, guys. If you have any questions, I would love to answer them now.
We've had a couple of questions come in through the chat. So the first one says, out of curiosity, how did the students feel about the AI search tools embedded into library databases, e.g. ProQuest? Like, was it the best of both worlds? Why or why not?
That is a good question. So a lot of them felt that it was just an extra little tool that was there. The way that they appreciated the ProQuest one was it gave them extra keywords, and they really appreciated them giving them extra keywords in different searches, since it would come up with information that they weren't didn't know existed beforehand. So until I pointed it out to them, some of them didn't even notice it was there, despite it being like bright purple. But they did play around with it afterward. However, they thought it was highly limited in what it could do. So they were more interested in the results from the original database search than the AI tool additions. But good question.
Okay, and the second question that's rolled in is, what kind of discussions did students have about hallucinations with AI and how to spot them? Or were hallucinations something they were unfamiliar with?
So, very good question. So some of the students were familiar with hallucinations. The students who had played around with ChatGPT more were familiar with it than the students who were, there were only two of them who more heavily used like semantic scholar and research rabbit. And then there was a mixed bag overall. So we did talk about hallucinations and giving examples that were pulled from doing direct research from ChatGPT. And thankfully, I actually had examples from our university where some people had tried to publish information or papers that had hallucinatory texts within them. And so this was a direct example I could give them as a way to try and spot that more. The way that we talked about it was pulling those citations from whatever resources they got from generative AI into a library page, and then trying to find the results that way, which they really appreciate as another way to fail safe and check. But great question.
Do we have any other questions?
May I ask a question? Sorry.
Sure.
Jumping out of my role. So I had a session way back when where we were sort of trying to discuss the differences between, using Gen AI versus library databases or even like advanced Google. And I found that a lot of the students were still so skeptical that even when they had tested it out, they knew some of the kind of murkier areas of AI and all of that. They were still like, but it's so much faster. Did you see any of that, or did the students really like kind of pick up on what you were sharing, or just curious your thoughts on that?
I did when we were doing the AI demonstration question. So when they were going off into their own and doing the Copilot search, every time I popped into one of the rooms, a lot of them were like, this is we're doing this correctly? Like is this a result we're supposed to be getting? And so a lot of them were wondering that if those were real and everything like that. And the same thing when most of the students have brought up ChatGPT, they weren't using it as like a direct result to come and get in, but a lot of them were using it as like that different talk that they were going through in order to bring up their research. But every time like we asked about these or showed them like semantic scholar, research rabbit, they're like, they're real results. You're right, we can, and that's when the discussion came into more of like the validating them through the library resources as well.
All right, we've got another question in the chat. Was there anything the students brought up that surprised the faculty members? And then a second question as part of this was, are you promoting this type of session to other faculty as well?
I think what's something that did surprise one of our faculty members, of the two who were in that session, was they were so sure that every student was using AI in everything. They went in very confident because they are very pro AI. They like to use it on a lot of different things. And so when students came with more uncertainty than them, that surprised them. It's mixed about promoting it to other faculty as well. I usually wait for faculty to come to me about AI questions and then bring like, hey, this is something we've done as like a compare and contrast in order to show what types of results and different types of information you can find if they're playing with AI tools or if you allow a lot of AI in your classrooms. Here at UNT, we do have a similar policy where faculty who are making courses make their own designation on whether or not AI is allowed in different aspects. And so it changes from course to course. And so I usually wait for faculty to come to me rather than promoting it.
That makes sense. Any other questions? some thank yous coming in the chat.
Stop sharing.
All right, hearing no more questions. Nora, do you want to wrap us up?
Sure, thank you so much. And if Kelly or Doris, you'd like to go ahead and stop the recording.